Let's get this podcast going. Let's welcome everybody out today to episode 62 of Utah in the Weeds. My name's Chris Holifield.
And I'm Tim Pickett. And today we basically announce we have a full house of open pharmacies in Utah.
This is big.
And
this is really big, Tim. This is big.
Yeah, it's kind of like day one again. And for that announcement, it's the perfect time to talk about how to pay for your cannabis with Tyler Beuerlein.
He's from Hypur, who, if you've been to any of the cannabis dispensaries here in Utah, well, really anywhere, you probably are familiar with. You've seen that as an option, as a way to pay for your products. So it's an interesting topic to be able to bring to the podcast and kind of find out the back end of it, the ins and outs, and kind of what's coming, even some of the stuff of what's coming up here in the next little while here in Utah.
Exactly, because right now, if you buy cannabis in anywhere in the U.S., most people know you have to use cash still, because Visa, MasterCard, they won't accept those transactions. But Hypur has found a way to do that. And our conversation today kind of explains that process, why it's like that, and what things we could look forward to make that a little bit easier. Because I know there's been a lot of listeners and a lot of patients of mine that have talked about how cumbersome it is to have to register and have to wait for those days for the transaction to go through. So we go through all of that today. But like I say, it's a good day to go through it because you can buy cannabis now legally in 14 locations in Utah.
When do they announce that 15th location, Tim? Do we know?
So there's not, I have talked to a few people about that. There's not a date for the request. They do an application process, which hasn't even started. The state has not, as far as I know, hasn't put out the request for a proposal yet. So no plans, no information on when that 15th pharmacy will be announced. I mean, come on, it's going to be in Moab.
Yeah, well, it better be.
Don't you think?
Mean, it really needs to be. And the fact that they haven't even, we need to get this ball rolling with how long it took them to get all the other pharmacies opened up. This is going to take forever. I mean, they're going to need to have 18 locations and 20 by the time they get out the 15th. This is,
it's totally true.
But anything else? Let's see, utahmarijuana.org/podcast. You can listen to all the podcast episodes there. You can share them with your family and friends. Let's get this, get the word out about the podcast. There's a lot of good information out there that a lot of people can benefit from. So let's get the word out about the podcast. And anything else you want to mention before we get into the episode, Tim?
The only other thing is, if you want to reach out to us, use utahmarijuana.org. Reach out to Chris or I. If you know somebody with a great story that you think needs to be shared, we'll love to have them on the podcast. Check out our, stay informed with our events, because we're going to be out there in the community at these events as the place opens up, because apparently COVID is over.
As the world opens up. Awesome. I'm excited though. So in Salt Lake City, their next issue's coming out here soon. So we'll keep everybody posted on that. But
cool. Enjoy this conversation.
All right, guys, here we go. First of all, let's find out where you're based out of, Tyler. Where are you based out of right now?
Scottsdale, Arizona.
Now, is that where Hypur, the complete organization, the company, is based out of, or is that just you?
It is. It's we're based out of Scottsdale. We've got some remote C-suite execs, and we live on planes. So I say I'm based in Scottsdale and Southwest Airlines.
Oh wow! So why all the travel?
We have institutions that are clients all over the country that bank the industry, and then that's parlayed into becoming a resource for many of the state governments, federal government as well, and then I've been fortunate to speak at a number of events now. So every week is different, every day is different. So it just depends on what's going on during that time.
So tell us what Hypur is. What is Hypur?
Yeah, Hypur it's very different depending on where it's facing. And what I mean by that is Hypur is a technology that was built by bankers for bankers to solve their challenges with highly regulated industries. So, people think that this is just a cannabis issue. It's really not. I would argue it's as much of a cash-intensive issue as a federal illegality issue, because from a compliance standpoint, for a bank or credit union to bank this industry, it's very cumbersome, it's very difficult, and there's a ton of risk. And so we were built to help institutions enter and scale within these markets. That led to the payment side of Hypur. We knew we had to start with compliance because at the end of the day, this is a banking problem, not a payment problem. And if you couldn't solve the banking side of it, the payment mechanism would never survive. And we've seen that play out year after year, and we're about to see it play out with another product that's become really popular in the industry, unfortunately.
Whose idea was it for Hypur? Like, was it one person's idea? I mean, to go against banking and cannabis, that just seems like there was a lot of that's a lot of legal problems. That's a big can of worms to open up. I mean, was that a tough? I'm throwing a lot of questions out there, I guess.
No, that's great.
I mean, how did that work out? Like in the very beginning, man. I mean, to cannabis first of all, and then you're up against the federal government with money and banking. How did that work?
Well, it didn't, to be honest. I mean, it was a very heavy lift, and I was very fortunate. Our founders, one of them in particular, banked high-risk industries for 20 plus years with a community bank in California, knew this inside out, had been through the regulatory hurdles in other industries. And then we had a team of founders that were all experts in their specific area. But I can tell you that when we first launched, I was there 7 years ago when probably the first bank in the country started banking this in Colorado. I was literally in the building. And what people don't realize is not only were the institutions trying to understand how to do this, but regulators were trying to understand it too. And so you had this weird dynamic where, it took a very unique type of bank to take the risk. Then the regulators came in, they didn't understand the industry, they didn't want banks banking it because they didn't know how to examine an institution. And I'll never forget, one of our founders asked the examiners, first ever examination of a bank in this space, they asked him to lunch. And he asked him the question, he said, look, is there an FFIEC handbook, which is essentially the advisory body to regulators on how to examine an institution banking the space? And the regulator said no. And he said, well, how do you examine an institution when you have no guidance? And the regulator literally held up his hands. He said, we're winging it. And, that was very problematic for a number of reasons. One, they didn't understand the industry, so they asked for things that were not attainable, right? And they held institutions to a standard that could not be checked by anybody. And then you had, even within the same regulatory body, different regions would take a different stance on it. And so you had this dichotomy where every regulator looked at it differently. Even by region, they looked at it differently. And so there was no real framework. There was no real set of rules. And so over time, over the last 7 years, and I've been fortunate to spend a lot of time with regulatory bodies, all of them, they've all come up with, I would say, a general standard of what their expectations are. And that has propelled more institutions in over the years because it's not just this, it's not just this floating, unattainable thing. They can permissibly bank this industry. It's been done for 7 years now. And there's a model and there's a set expectation of what's required of those institutions.
And this comes because you basically, I think people, they don't really understand this at its core. You can't just go down to the bank with a pile of cash and deposit it, and then come back the next day with another pile of cash and deposit it, selling what quote unquote legal cannabis or another type of product that is what you would call like high risk, but we're in the cannabis space, so we can just use that as a good example. Even you could say like California has a legal medical market. I can legally sell it in California like we can here. You can legally sell it. You can't just go to the bank. And you're saying because there's no regulation, the bank can't really accept your money.
No, it's not even that. And again, going back to the cash intensive nature, when you're dealing in a cash intensive environment, if I'm a bank and I accept $100,000 in cash, and my regulator comes to me and says, hey, prove to me that that $100,000 in cash came from legitimate transactions and not a terrorist organization. If you can't prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that those monies came from a verifiable transaction or verifiable business, you're in the hot seat. And what people don't realize is not only is the bank or credit union charter on the line, but the officers of the institutions have personal liability. So if I'm a chief compliance officer of a bank and something goes wrong and my regulator determines that it was my fault, I can have a civil money penalty imposed on me personally that can't be covered by the insurance policy of the institution. So it's not just liability on the institution side. Everybody involved has liability at this point. And one other thing I'll touch on, in California, I was involved in that state, I would say the government level from an advisory standpoint for a long time. And one thing we tried to preach to them over time was, look, the reason institutions aren't banking your market and the reason you have a cash crisis is because you haven't come up with a finite regulatory framework for your program. So California 20 years ago passed this, I'm going to say a gray medical market. None of the municipalities followed. And so as a bank or credit union, or from a regulator standpoint, how do I bank an industry if I can't even determine whether or not an operator is complying with state or local law? And so when they implemented their regulatory framework, January 1, 2018, we saw a whole slew of institutions come in to bank it. And I would argue, no matter where you're at in the country at this point, if you can't, or you're not banked and you're in the cannabis industry, you either just don't want to pay any fees or you're doing something nefarious. This industry is banked regardless of what's published in the media.
Interesting. And in Utah, the institution that's decided to step up in Utah was Utah First Credit Union, right? But why a credit union, not like a Citibank or a?
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what type of institution it is. It doesn't matter if they're nationally chartered. It doesn't matter if they're state chartered. Every one of those regulatory bodies has experience with the state legal cannabis space. Now, I will say this: the NCUA has been, I would say, at the pinnacle as far as trying to help institutions behind the scenes, trying to be open-minded about it with the thought that, look, our communities are much safer with this cash off the streets than it being out there. And so I would say that they've done some things progressively that other regulators just haven't. And so if I'm a credit union, I take comfort in that, whereas many banks, don't necessarily have that comfort level.
Interesting.
Got a couple of questions here. I want to make sure that we ask them. I asked online here, Tyler, if any of our listeners had any questions that we'd be chatting with you. And one of our listeners, actually, Zach King, he was on the podcast before, so he's a former guest. His first question is one question I have is, what is it that takes the process longer than a day or two when some other transactions are instantaneous?
It's an ACH. And so it depends on when a transaction is run through a financial institution. Hypur doesn't, I'm going to say, touch money, right? So our banks that openly bank the state legal cannabis industry move the funds from the consumer's account into the merchant's, right? That is subject to the Fed processing times for ACH. So if a transaction is run on a Saturday and it's after 5 o'clock, it's not going to hit until the following Monday. And then there are situations where a transaction is pulled from a consumer's account. Maybe they withdrew monies after the time that we validated the funds were available in their account. And so there's an overdraft. And so we represent to collect those funds on the 1st and 15th. So those things are not ideal. But I can tell you that we are about to launch a product that's much more mainstream and will really help mitigate some of those issues.
Can you talk about this product, or is it top secret kind of?
Not too much. I can tell you that it's been approved at the state level, and it's going to be, again, much more mainstream, and it will not have any of those delays in transaction processing.
Because like when you go to Nevada, it's my understanding that it's essentially like an ATM system at the terminal.
They're about to go down nationwide. The cashless ATMs they've become really popular in the state legal cannabis industry. They're not permissible. They're not sustainable. And I don't want to say too much, but I would expect those products to be gone within the next 60 days.
All together, right? Like, I mean, I was literally there 3-4 weeks ago. You put your card in, and essentially like a cashless ATM. And I'm thinking, oh well, they're getting around the merchant piece and this sort of thing. Wow, so what you're saying is there are products.
So let's talk about that for a second. What I'm saying is the cashless ATM model in its own right is fraudulent, right? Because you're representing to an acquiring bank that this is a on-premise physical ATM that's not being used at the point of purchase for a federally illegal product. Above and beyond that, there are some network issues. There are some documentation issues. And I'll just say that it's not above board, regardless of what's being presented in the to the merchants. And there are some things that work that are going to be here very soon.
Well, that kind of leads me to a question that Zach had. He had one more question here that he wants to know if the MORE Act gets signed, in what way will that affect Hypur, if it will affect it in any way?
Yeah, we've gotten a lot of questions about MORE, and we've gotten a lot of questions about SAFE, and I've actually spent a lot of time with some lobbyists and politicians on these things, and it doesn't have much of an effect, unfortunately. So if you're talking about the SAFE Act or MORE, again, the industry is already banked. Regulators and institutions have worked together over the last 7 years to really, I'm going to say, solve this problem. But more importantly, people want credit cards. Right? Understandably so. It's convenient. They know it. People want that ease of transaction. The branded card networks have been very specific about federal legality, right? So they are not going to enter the market until the product is federally legal. And there are a number of reasons behind that. And so, it's interesting. I've been fortunate to be on the board of MJ Biz, and they did a poll when the SAFE Act got passed through the House, and they said, what are you most excited about? And probably 80% of the people that reacted said, we're so excited to run credit cards. Well, that's not in the realm of possibility until federal legality. Those two acts don't change the federal legal status of the product. And so, unfortunately, I don't see that having much of an impact from a payment and banking standpoint. Even when this goes federally legal, yes, credit cards will be there, but this will still be a highly regulated, cash-intensive industry, and your banking options are going to remain limited.
See, I think that it's important for us to talk about this because it's important to keep these expectations in kind of like the scope of reality. There's just so much misinformation, and it's not intentional. It's just that we all just kind of make it up, I guess. We're all kind of making up what we want and what we want to see.
Well, you have expectations of how things should work, right? In a mainstream industry, and people get frustrated and they say, well, why can't I do this? And we have to tell them, look, I mean, again, this is still a federally illegal industry. Even though the states have approved it, and even though it's spreading like wildfire, you've got to contend with that. But then people don't understand the cash-intensive business issues. I mean, I've probably sent over 1,000 merchants to a banker credit union that will bank them over the years. But I get calls from the gun and ammo industry, payday lenders, check cashing companies, all of these companies that have banking issues, just like cannabis. The topic's not as polarizing, so people don't really talk about it, right? So it's just one of those things. And to your point, it's grossly misinformed. And then combine that with all of the bad actors that see dollar signs come sprinting towards the cannabis market and misinform merchants intentionally because they want to make money, right? And so you've got this dichotomy that just, it's not ideal.
To kind of change this a little bit, if you go to like a discussion about crypto and blockchain, right? You've got a kind of a growing, this same kind of hype, right? And you bypass the banking industry a little bit. You keep your money offline. I mean, do you see a place for that to come up?
No. No, I'll tell you a story. I was with I won't say who, but I was with a very large regulatory body. And it was somebody very high up in that regulatory body in a full room of examiners. And they wanted to know what was happening on the ground floor in certain states, within the region. And the question was posed by this person, what do you think of cryptocurrency being involved in payments in the space? I said, honestly, I don't think it has any place. You're trying to combine one highly regulated industry that banks and credit unions already have a nightmare trying to handle with another. And I said, from a compliance standpoint, it scares the heck out of me. There are taxation issues that are awful. And before I could even finish what I was saying, this person slammed their fist on the table and said, you're damn effing right. If we find out our institutions are banking payment companies that participate in both crypto and cannabis, they're either going to have to shut down those accounts or fold their program entirely. So, one, I don't know what benefit it really provides at the end of the day. Two, I think it's a long ways off. Plus, you've also got same-day ACH coming. It's already being implemented. And so a lot of the argument about instant transfers or things being cheaper, I think you're going to see go by the wayside. It's an interesting topic. People naturally relate the two, but there's really no place for it.
Sure. Because if you don't have, the named merchant like the Visa, the MasterCard, the American Express, you're essentially, what I've heard was you basically bypass that, right? And you just pay with some other type of currency than cash. But like you say, this is eventually you have to put your money somewhere. Just like with cash, you cannot have a business that's that big.
Correct. And the other part of it is too, and I try to explain this to people, your most valuable asset in this industry is your licensure, right? So if you're doing something nefarious or you're trying to get around the system or skirt rules and regulations, you're only hurting yourself. I mean, your goal in this industry, essentially you're in the compliance business now. Right? And everything you do should be in that vein. And everything that your bank or credit union is asking you for is because they're trying to do things right to sustainably bank the market and help you. And I know it can be cumbersome. I know it can be difficult. I get calls from merchants all the time saying, why is my bank or credit union asking for this? And my response to them is because they're doing it right. And you should be thankful for that.
Where do you see things go? With Hypur, where do you see this in 5 years? Or is it hard to see where things will be in 5 years?
This industry is so nascent. We jokingly refer to it. I tell people I'm 7 years in the industry, but they're really dog years. So I'm approaching 50 in cannabis. And there's so much that happens. And I don't think that federal legality is coming anytime soon, unfortunately. And I know that goes against what many people say. I've been around too many politicians, that they're going to tell you what you want to hear. And at the end of the day, getting something to move that's that major, I don't see happening anytime soon. Even if it does, it's going to remain a highly regulated industry. And so for us, I think we understand the branded card networks will come eventually. And I think for us, it's getting ourselves in a position where we can provide that service, and I don't mean to oversimplify, but at the flip of a switch for our ecosystem at a rate that's comparable to what mainstream industry operates in, and really just help the industry be transparent and thrive. And we're a battleship, so we move quick, we adjust quickly because we know that we have to, and we expect change quickly. So I don't know if I can answer that, succinctly, but that's kind of how we think about this world. And we're going to be going into other industries shortly as well.
Do you care to share anything more on that? Other industries, as far as like what kind of industries?
Yeah, I think again we're seeing the pain points in other highly regulated industries, and people are coming to us naturally saying, "Hey, you've been able to quote unquote conquer that," and that's kind of the pinnacle of I would say compliance issues. So can you help us with this? So whether it be and I'm just throwing some things out there that are high risk. Again, all your money service businesses, that's how they're referred to them, check cashers, payday lenders, cross-border remittance, potentially online gaming, things that have present major issues to institutions trying to bank them. I think all of those things are in play for us.
Do you find that Hypur does some things really well and some things you're just not built for?
Yeah, and I think you can't be everything to everyone, right? And because we deal with so many different aspects of the industry, it's been a challenge for us. And we've tried to make adjustments quickly. We've tried to, we're always trying to grow. And much of what we've become is as a result of, regulators asking questions of institutions that they couldn't answer, or, could we provide this level of data on these certain things? So yeah, I think, I think to say that, we've operated in a flawless manner is just not accurate. We're trying to grow. We're always trying to improve, and we're trying to do that based off market feedback. So the answer is no, but those things have also helped us get better.
Do you find that now you've seen opportunities for Hypur is getting pretty good at helping people with the banking side of things, helping people with that transaction, from the consumer to making those transactions happen seamlessly. But we've noticed that, man, there's a gap here. We would love some help. If somebody would just come in and do this other thing, do you feel like there's, I guess I'm asking kind of an open-ended question here, but you're just at the forefront of something that really we don't know anybody else who's there.
Yeah.
Right? You just don't go in, right? Like if I need my medicine delivered, I have to go through Hypur in Utah.
Yeah.
That's how this works.
Yeah.
Because the statute won't allow cash.
Well, and that's also a testament to the state government having an extensive background in banking and not wanting to see the industry go through the same hardship that's happening in every other market. So, I know that that's a little bit of a challenge for the industry, but at the end of the day, it's the best thing they could have done. Again, going back to the compliance side of this, they really understood the challenges and wanted to mitigate that exposure and that hardship. So I guess I would answer your question like this. I think that, again, the cannabis industry is so nascent. Every market's its own planet, right? You can't compare Utah to Oklahoma. You can't compare Arizona to New York, right? They're all so different. And so we've really tried to integrate with the right partners that have solved problems in those areas to make the process for the consumer more seamless. And I think that to that question, the product that we're about to launch, I think addresses a lot of those things and has been developed based on consumer demand, merchant need, in providing the industry with something that's much more mainstream.
Yeah, I think that the patients here, the customer here, there's been some talk that 30 to 50% of the transactions have hiccups because of the onboarding process. It's not necessarily Hypur, it's the onboarding process to make sure that your bank is connected to the system so that they can withdraw funds and transfer funds, and that has been quite cumbersome. But just like with the EVS, the electronic verification system in Utah, that system is also extremely cumbersome. And it just seems like at every turn, in fact, a lot of patients will tell you this, it seems like Utah doesn't want me to smoke weed at every turn.
Yeah.
Right? They're just making it hard at every turn.
Yeah. And from our standpoint, I mean, I will, I'll be very candid with you. One of the things that happened probably 9 months ago is when Plaid was about to get acquired by Visa, they went out to any operator that was using Plaid for verification that had any tie to cannabis and said, "You're gone. You're off the platform." And so, that's a big part of HyperPay, right? We've got to verify those funds. Again, you're getting into compliance. And so we've had to shift to another provider. That's been challenging. And then there's some smaller institutions in Utah that maybe aren't up to speed from a technology standpoint, which also complicates those things. So those are things that our team is very aware of. We're working through them on a daily basis and trying to mitigate those issues. But again, the new product that's coming out, I think you're going to find that really addresses a lot of those pain points. And I think that it will be very, very beneficial to not only the merchants, but the consumers first and foremost, in the Utah market. And I'm sorry to be vague, guys. We're probably 2 weeks out, and so I'll be able to share more at that time.
Now, what's your background, Tyler? I mean, we didn't even go there really. Have you always been involved in cannabis, or is it more financial that your background is, or?
Yeah, I grew up in Arizona, went to school in Northern California. I was a baseball player. So I did that for a number of years on the East Coast. I was in the Mets organization for a long time. And then when I got out, I worked for a private equity real estate firm in Arizona, kind of cut my teeth on the investment side. And then I started a sports drink company with the founders of Four Loko, ironically.
Yeah.
Remember that?
That's a good beverage.
Back in the day.
Yeah.
One of the founders is a close friend of mine. And so, really dove into that, the beverage world, CPG, dealing with retailers, dealing with distributors. And after about 6 years of that, transitioned right into Hypur day one. And so I've been on the front lines of this industry in a very unique way, and really been very lucky to see it, from the front of the front lines. We see everything from the financial institutions out, but that gives us transparency into who's doing what markets are doing what are regulators looking for, what are state governments looking for, what's the federal government trying to do, and so it's been a rocket ride, and I'm very thankful for just to be in it. It's been amazing.
Do you feel like you have a better, certainly you have a different insight, but to me, it seems like you might have a better insight as to what's happening nationally because of, how many states is Hypur in?
We're in every state with a market, but even then, at this point, typically if a state's considering it, we're typically involved, or I'm typically involved at least, just, to be a sounding board or, be a resource.
I mean, like I said, I was thinking that you're probably in a position to where you can see the shifting in a different way than everybody else, because you have visibility essentially into every marketplace and what the nation is doing, even more so than huge cannabis companies like Curaleaf or, like huge retail operators like MedMen. They can only see as far as they can reach.
Yeah, and so I've helped a lot of those companies as well, just with maybe certain points of information that are general in certain markets. But yeah, again, going back to being fortunate, not only that, we've been able to see most transactions from a consolidation standpoint, because when there's a change of beneficial ownership, typically we know about it first. So it's been really fascinating to watch not only the consolidation, but also the public markets, have been very interesting. And you saw this big influx of money into the Canadian companies, because the Canadian companies were going to operate in the first legal market. Then they were going to come down and acquire everything in the US. And I think, I posted about this on LinkedIn the other day. I actually think it's going to happen in reverse. I think the Canadian companies, they're losing money at an unsustainable rate. They have no exit. The notion that export is going to be a viable business model is, I think, a fallacy. I think that the Canadian market as a whole, I think the tax revenues generated by the state of California alone are greater than the entire Canadian cannabis market today. I think that's a huge problem for them, right? And then the massive influx of money into those companies, with the notion that they're going to come down and acquire the U.S. MSOs upon federal legalization, that may not happen anytime soon. They're bleeding money like crazy. The U.S. MSOs continue to gobble up assets, and their revenues are going through the roof. And the point that so few talk about is, if federal legalization falls, all of the U.S. MSOs uplist to the U.S. markets, and the whole advantage for the Canadian companies is gone. So it's really interesting to see, kind of the public sentiment about different companies as opposed to what's really happening on the ground floor. And then state by state, investors, they always want to know what's happening. And there are certain states that I wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole from an investment standpoint. Oklahoma comes to mind as number one. I think they've issued a retail license for every 80 patients in the state, which is a giant sprint to the bottom. And then you've got markets like, candidly, Utah. From an investment standpoint, I don't know that there's a better market in the country. You've got a very limited regime. You've only got 14 retail licenses, about to be 15, as you know. You've only got 8 cultivators, chronic pain's in approved condition, and these guys are doing revenues that are healthy even for a rec market already. So very bullish about Utah specifically for those reasons.
That's really interesting because there's a lot of different opinions here. And one of the things I was thinking of when you were talking about Canada and exporting cannabis to the United States, I had talked about this to somebody else. Chris, we've talked about it too. There's an army of a legit army of cannabis growers in the U.S. Disparate systems, but there are so many people and so much infrastructure being built, all separated, all not together. There's no scale per se, but all you've got to do is inject a little bit of money and there'll be instant scale. And in 37, 40 states that all grow.
Yeah, and I think you're going to see the operators that have dominated the California cannabis industry. You've got premium flower being grown there outdoor at a cost that I'm sorry, I don't see anybody in Canada even getting remotely close to competing with. And they're only going to expand scale, right? Yeah. And then you're seeing it in other markets already. It's going to become commoditized. And then the other part of it is, even if the federal legal status changes, I don't see interstate commerce occurring anytime soon either. That's a whole other issue that's got to be addressed. So, it wouldn't surprise me if in the next 2 years you saw the U.S. MSOs acquire the Canadian assets at pennies on the dollar, and the whole dynamic get reversed, because what they're doing right now is not sustainable, and the U.S. market just continues to thrive.
Wow. And in the meantime, instant ACH kind of solves a lot of the problems for the consumer, really, and
our new product will too.
And your new product will too, and so that's just going to get easier for essentially people in every state. Now, can I register, if I'm registered at Hypur, can I purchase cannabis in other states using that same system, or are they separate?
You can. Yeah. No, you can if any state you're in, if you're in California, you could go to Caliva and purchase with Hypur. So it doesn't matter what state you're in. If it's a legal transaction, you can consummate it at those retailers.
Just give people another incentive to walk through the process, even if they think it's just one extra step, right?
Sure. I know it's not ideal. And look, if we could, we're always trying to improve it, but if we could, mitigate those things and make it just a straight mainstream credit card transaction, sure, we would. But unfortunately we can't today, so we're doing the best we can, and we're trying to get it. We're always trying to improve.
I think it's a great alternative. I think it's a great choice. I think it's great to have that as an option for people to purchase.
Yeah, I do too. And from the provider standpoint, we are only looking for expansion of the information, destigmatizing cannabis as a tool in the medicine toolbox, right? And if I can get somebody off of opioids and they're in Moab and they need delivery, or they're in some rural area, or they can't get out of bed. Frankly, we have tons of patients who just can't get to the dispensary, the pharmacy. Yeah. And so they need that home delivery. I agree, cash is not a good idea for home delivery, because you end up with drivers who have $40,000 driving around every day, and that's not safe.
Yeah.
In fact, I just had a DEA prosecutor over at my house this last week that was talking about how much they hate cannabis because they hate guns. And the black market includes guns, and people get shot because they have too much cash.
Going back to highly regulated industries, it's a challenge. And I think also, in going into delivery, I think one thing we found in some large sophisticated operators were already getting this before COVID. COVID just sped it up. But I think that as markets expand, these retailers are realizing that the biggest addressable market now is the fringe consumer that maybe doesn't know they love edibles yet, but they're going to, but those people expect an Amazon-like experience. They expect convenience. They expect it to be mainstream, and they're not going to stand for, a non-mainstream mechanism. And so, again, going back to, what we're about to do, it's much more in that vein. And again, same concept. I mean, yes, we're in this for profit, but we also want to provide a compliant, sustainable means of transaction to an industry that's the cat's out of the bag. It's here, it's thriving. And to your point, if we can get people off of opioids and all of these other awful pharma products that have just ruined lives over and over, we can't do it fast enough.
I agree 100%. Anything else you want to ask him, Tim, while we have him? I mean, I don't want to hold him up here all day. I'm sure Tyler's got other things he wants to go do. Anything else you want to talk about, Tyler, while we got you here? Or
I don't think so.
I feel like we kind of skimmed the surface with a lot of things and kind of gave the overall.
Yeah, I think that it's this is an important conversation, like I've said, and I'm excited to have you on. I think it explains a lot to people who are willing to listen to, this interview and to dig in a little bit about the process of payments, why it's this way, and what you're working on to try to help. For the most part, the bankers, people are, they need a place to put, the retailers need a place to put their money. They need to be able to be legal so they don't get shut down. And on our side, we deal with so many consumers who just need better access.
Yeah.
So, thanks for coming on. It's been really exciting.
One of the thing I just throw out there, just as a resource, if people want to contact us or me, they can find me on LinkedIn, or they can get a hold of me. I mean, my phone number's out there. I think at this point. So if anybody has any questions or needs a referral to a bank or credit union that will bank them, the one thing we've done since the beginning is anytime somebody calls us, it doesn't matter where they're at, doesn't matter what their situation is, hemp-based CBD, cannabis, any of those other highly regulated industries, we will always refer them directly to an institution that will bank them. And we've never asked for anything in return. We want to help. We want to be that resource. So if anybody needs it, please have them reach out.
And then I guess just, people could check out the Hypur app, go download it in any app player or app store on their phones, iPhone, Android, whatnot.
And you're going to need it in Utah if you want home delivery, or you don't want to go to the ATM at the pharmacy or use cash. I mean, that is the option.
And there's no cost to the consumer.
Well, we'll wrap this episode up. Thank you so much, Tyler. Really quickly, while we're recording here, we want to mention that you can download all the episodes of the podcast. You can listen to those at utahmarijuana.org/podcast. Anything else you want to add? Anything else you want to say and tell the listeners, Tim, before we wrap this episode up?
No, I don't think so. Thanks, guys, for listening. Stay safe out there.